Good Friday morning, everyone. It is 9 o'clock. It or thereabouts. It is 9:16, which means it is time for another episode of the Urban Ecology Center's Backyard Naturalist. I am your host this week. My name is Tim for one of the culinary episodes of the Backyard Naturalist. Sometimes we talk about what's in your yard, sometimes we talk about what's in your house, sometimes we talk about what's in your kitchen. And today we're featuring a mineral that is very likely in all of those places. The Roman senator Cassiodorus once said, "Mankind can live without gold, but not without salt." And that is oh so true. We need salt. And not just once in a while, we need it every day to maintain a healthy balance of living. So sit back from wherever you are and relax and join us for a journey of learning about the stories salt has to tell us on episode 2 of season 6 of The Backyard Naturalist. And I do apologize for the complete lack of creativity and unoriginality of the title and the title slide here, just straight up copied. I was not at my creative best. I am letting someone else be creative for me as we explore the salt of the earth. I often, when we do a culinary episode, like to put whatever it is that we're talking about, the plant, the spice, in my coffee, but I decided not to put salt in my coffee today. Piggybacking on the creativity of others, in this case PBS, we proudly thank the viewers like you who are tuned in with us here this morning. Whether you're here live or watching this recorded, we are glad you are here. And a huge thank you to all of our subscribers who are joining us. You keep this program going and allow us to keep it free to the community. So thank you. There are several levels to which you can subscribe, and one of them is the super subscription, which allows you to attend our new monthly field trips that are starting next month, where we will have local movers and shakers, because we're talking about salt, who will be showing off their favorite local green spaces to us in Milwaukee and the greater Milwaukee area. So if you're interested in learning more about the benefits of a subscription, and it's something that you can and choose to do, we please contact any of us at the Urban Ecology Center's research team. And I do want to plug what is looking to be a really fun upcoming class for lifelong learners of all ages. Amanda's going to be teaching a class on mammalogy. So it's part indoor book learning. If you miss that from high school or college or grade school, it's going to be part in the field learning. It's a 8-week course, and when you're done, you'll probably know so much more about this animal grouping to which we humans belong, which is the mammals. So don't miss out on this super cool opportunity to learn from and with Amanda and your fellow class of learners. We do have a few space stories that we've been tracking to check on because space is connected to our backyards through space. And the first is the Polaris Dawn mission, which just ended successfully. 4 private astronauts went on a 5-day mission. And during that mission, they set all kinds of firsts and broke records. This was the first of 3 Polaris missions being funded by the billionaire entrepreneur Jared Isaacman. They climbed higher over Earth than any spaceflight since the Apollo missions at 875 miles, which allowed them to study how increased radiation farther from the Earth's surface affects equipment, systems, astronauts, which is a precursor to sending people back to the moon and sending people to Mars. So important. Interestingly, this mission also allowed for the record number of humans in orbit around Earth at the same time in our history, because in addition to these 4 astronauts, there were 9 humans on the International Space Station from Russia and the United States. There are 3 people aboard a newly launched Russian Soyuz, and there are 3 humans on China's space station currently. So 19 humans total in orbit around the planet, a new record during this mission. And they had the first private spacewalk. But maybe my favorite thing that they did is that on the last full day in orbit, to test SpaceX's Starlink satellite, which I'm not that excited about, but their ability to downlink uh, events. One of the astronauts, Sarah Gillis, played Rey's theme from Star Wars on her violin. So this is the first violin performance from space. And once it was transmitted to Earth, her solo track was mixed with other orchestral performances to produce a musical piece called Harmony of Resilience. Maybe more exciting is that Frito-Lay finally produced a safe for space Dorito for the astronauts. The problem with Doritos in the past is that the flavors were dusted on the chips. And so if you eat them, then the crumbs can kind of fly into the station and interfere with the systems of the craft. So Frito-Lay introduced an oil-based flavoring that minimizes the potential for little crumbs of Doritos to mess things up. Very important. So the first astronauts to eat Doritos in space. And say what you will, and I have conflicting thoughts about the private space movement, space uh, missions. There was a lot of activities to raise money for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, including items to be auctioned off that they carried with them, copies of a little stuffed animal, a reading of a children's book called Kisses from Space to pediatric cancer patients, and a lot more activities and records and experiments. So it seemed like quite an action-packed and successful mission. And then you have the Boeing Starliner mission, which doesn't quite carry the same level of enthusiasm. But astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams are getting used to their 10-day mission, which turned into an 8-month mission after malfunctions in the spacecraft. They had to watch their spacecraft return to Earth without them, and now they have become integrated with the crew on the International Space Station. And you can now watch a news conference with them on YouTube if you wish. You can kind of hear from themselves how they're feeling. They seem much more optimistic than I would expect. And they were kind of focusing on how fortunate they were to be able to, I guess, have the option to remain longer, right? Because then your life is in danger. So that's good. And they're integrating fully with the ISS crew. Later this month, a SpaceX Dragon capsule is going to go to the ISS with 2 empty seats. So when that spacecraft returns in February, they can finally hitch a ride back to Earth. And here's the video of them with their live press conference. If you're like me and you like to be in tune with the movement of the Earth around the sun, I like to pay attention to the solstices and equinoxes. We have another regular milestone occurring this Sunday at 7:43 a.m. Set your alarm. I will be awake at 7:43 a.m., which is do this for the autumnal equinox, the astronomical beginning of autumn. And according to the book Fablehaven, which I'm reading with my family, this is a big party night for all the mystical creatures of the world. So the fairies, the imps, the brownies. So if you want to follow heed to that, there can be a lot of mischief. You might want to just stay in your bed that whole night. Maybe put earplugs in your ears and just let the shenanigans happen so you don't invite them into your house. Big party on planet Earth, and the equinox, of course, marks the day when all of the Earth receives 12 days, 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night. If you're on the North Pole or the South Pole, this marks the beginning of the 6-month-long day or night, as the sun is either going to slip below the horizon on the North Pole for 6 months or come above the horizon in the South Pole for 6 months. So, here we go, talking about salt. Every once in a while, a backyard naturalist moves from the backyard into the house, sometimes specifically into the kitchen, because a lot of our food and drink comes directly from plants and animals that have their own unique natural history and stories to tell. Salt is an exception. This is not coming from a plant, an animal. It's not coming from a living organism. It's a mineral, part of the abiotic ecological world that's very important, and it is an essential mineral at that. It's a mineral that helps keep your body in stasis. And whether or not you know the definition of stasis, be glad it exists because it keeps you alive. It's the equilibrium in your body. It brings balance to your life. You need it every day. If you get too much or too little salt, your body notices and things start getting out of whack. And actually, my big takeaway from today is really how important salt is to our daily lives and how little I personally think about that fact, other than trying to maintain a healthy diet. It is called an essential nutrient for a reason, and we're going to explore this together. And I do want to mention off the bat that because salt is so important to us, I will be mentioning some health and medical information, and I want you to please remember that I'm not a health professional, so please don't consult in what I say for your health information. Please rely on your trusted health professionals. And with that out of the way, again, one of my biggest sources of information for today's episode and many of the episodes is the stuff you should know and how stuff works systems, website, podcast. They keep my lifelong journey fun, journey of learning fun and vibrant, and I encourage you to check them out on your own. And then, why am I showing a slide of this fun game? Which is a great game. I recommend this fun game to play. It's because when I watched my episode on guinea pigs last week with my daughter, who was the inspiration for that episode, as we were watching it, she said, "Dad, you say a lot. If this were the game, you'd have lost a long time ago." And then we counted, and I realized I said over 100 times during that episode, which is a great reminder to me and a humbling challenge as a speaker to try to be cognizant of how many times I use that as a pause to let my brain kind of reflect and how my speech is presented to you. So I have a challenge, just another way that my kids help me to improve my life and be accountable. Okay, let's talk about salt. Salt is a mineral. It's a mineral that is beautiful in its simplicity. Part Na, or sodium, part Cl, or chloride. It's not quite as simple as this. It's not a one-to-one dumbbell ratio, but you get the idea. And the first important thing to note is that each of these parts of salt, the sodium and the chloride by themselves, are quite volatile and dangerous and toxic to life. Sodium is a silvery white metal that reacts violently if you mix it with water in the absence of chloride. It oxidizes in air, highly reactive, does not occur in nature as a free metal. So you won't see it like this outside of a lab. But it is the sixth most abundant element in the Earth's crust, usually found in minerals like feldspar and, of course, rock salt. And the salts of sodium, like rock salt, are highly water soluble, which is why sodium is one of the most common dissolved elements by weight in the oceans. Extremely common, just not isolated by itself. And then you have chlorine, which by itself at room temperature and our pressures is a yellow-green gas and also a very highly reactive corrosive one at that. But like sodium, and this is something I kind of forget, chlorine is absolutely essential for life. You will not find it isolated again in nature except for in a lab, but it is extremely common element in the Earth's crust and in seawater. So by themselves, sodium, chlorine, angry, corrosive, dangerous, together they are stable and happy and generous in their life-giving qualities as salt or sodium chloride. And in this representation, the purple spheres represent the positively charged sodium cations, and the green spheres, the larger green spheres, represent the negatively charged chloride anions, and then those little jaggedy yellow lines represent the electrostatic force between the two that makes them so stable in their ionic bonds. Stable, beautiful. This relationship causes the cubic nature of salt. So look closely at even those fine grains of table salt, and you will see that cubic nature of the salt grains, which allows you to perform this party trick. If you haven't seen it or performed, if you put a little salt on the table at a restaurant, bunch it up in one spot, you can balance the corner of a typical salt shaker on its edge because they usually have these little tiny edges on the corners. Put that on top of the tiny salt grains. Because the salt grains are cubic and have a flat top, it doesn't take a lot of salt. Just a few grains together, kind of spread out over an area, provides enough of a semi-continuous flat surface, and you can balance a salt shaker on it. Probably the coolest and most important reason why salt is cubic. It is about 40% chloride and 60% sodium, with the chloride packed together. If we go back here, the chloride's packed together, the sodium fills in all the tiny spaces, and then the most common way we see this arrangement that's not a drawing or a microscopic image is halite. This is rock salt. So now it looks like a mineral. Now it looks like, yeah, this is something that could form on the earth. This is a common way that we and other life forms find salt in natural environments. And I can't understate throughout this episode how important this mineral is to life. And explaining all the ways that this is true, we get real long, real fast. But the most important thing to consider is that salt is a mineral that is an electrolyte. And that is important because electrolytes conduct electricity in our body for pretty much all of the essential functions. And one of the most important of these, or at least the ones that we can probably relate to the best, is muscle movement. So the only way I am able to move my mouth muscles right now, push air across my vocal cords, is through muscle movement. Not even to mention the breathing I'm doing with my diaphragm, the involuntary movements of my heart, my circulatory system. These are all carried out by impulses that are made possible by electrolytes like salt. And there are countless other electric impulses in fluids and tissue. And this is so important that your body is constantly regulating to maintain an ideal salt balance, that range of life-giving balance through homeostasis. So our bodies are constantly regulating temperature, gas levels, other things, and including salt ratio. If your levels of salt become too low, you experience something called hyponatremia. And there's several things that can lead to hyponatremia. One being if you drink too much pure water, every once in a while you hear the dangers of just drinking too much water. Another way you can get this is through you get sick, heavy diarrhea, vomiting, too much sweating. You can also get it from high blood sugar. Essentially, anything that causes an imbalance in which sodium levels become too low, this can be dangerous. And it's why athletes often turn to Gatorade. It's why people going into the wilderness carry salt tablets. It's why recovery from illness often calls for things like Pedialyte instead of water. There are situations where drinking pure water can be harmful or exacerbate a condition, particularly if you're already experiencing low sodium levels, because in those situations, continuing to drink water will continue to lower the overall levels of sodium that your body needs for these systems and will also flush that salt from the system through your kidneys. I was in a situation at a pretty young age where I think it was summer camp and someone was pretty dehydrated and getting sick. And it seems so strange to me that they weren't just giving them water. They were giving them salt tablets because, I think salt would just make you more thirsty, which it does. But it's really important that you take that with the liquids because you're allowing your body to return to the normal levels of salt. The dehydration is an issue, but the electrolytes is also an issue, and both of those things have to be taken into account. So that allows your body to perform as it should. If it follows then that if too little salt leads to health problems, too much salt also leads to health problems in a different way. And when your body is dealing with too much salt, it's called hypernatremia. And the easiest way to get too much salt is from your food. Humans have been adding salt to food for pretty much ever, and we'll get to that in a minute, but especially processed foods can have really high sodium levels. So if you're eating excess sodium, you are you're creating an imbalance. And in this particular case, fluid then is being drawn out of your cells and into the extracellular fluids and into your blood. Meanwhile, your kidneys are starting to work overtime to process all that extra salt to get it out of your system, but they're overwhelmed, and it's like, a crowd trying to get into a stadium or anything where you have, more things trying to get in that can be processed. The excess is just pushed back in your blood system. There's like a bouncer just saying, "Yep, got to go back in the blood. Come back later. We can't get you now." And so what that does is it causes the volume of your blood to increase, and that leads to higher blood pressure, and that causes your heart to work harder, which can, in theory, lead to increased risk of heart attack and stroke. I say in theory because scientists still aren't exactly sure of the mechanisms of how this works, and because it's not just too much salt that can lead to heart attacks and strokes, too little salt can also lead to those. So they're just kind of, we understand that it's bad for you, but still not exactly sure why it's bad for you and what's beyond the mechanisms that we're understanding from a full body perspective, what's going on. So health organizations like the CDC and the National Heart, Blood, and Lung Institute, you will see different information from different organizations, and very few of them saying this is exactly what you need, because again, we're still not understanding totally what happens. So there is a range that's likely a healthy range. A good number to think about is that for stasis, for your body to function, your daily intake of salt should be probably no more than 6 grams, which is about a teaspoon. So that's fairly easy to remember. It can be lower, but you do need probably at least a half a teaspoon a day. So you don't want to go no salt. Shouldn't be more than 7 grams. The average American is eating 8 grams a day, which means many Americans are eating more than 8 grams a day. So using these numbers, a serving of canned soup, depending on the brand and the serving, has roughly 900 milligrams of salt. So you are already about half of the way with 1 can of soup to your recommended minimum allowance. A Big Mac has about 1,100 milligrams of salt. Big Mac isn't the worst offender. There's some other burgers that can easily approach 1,500 milligrams, which is already halfway to your minimum RDA. The Hungry Man Homestyle Meatloaf is above 1,600 milligrams of salt. So regardless of whose numbers you go by and what we know about common sense, you want to pay attention to salt. You want to avoid processed foods if you can. And that just makes sense in a lot of ways. It's not just the salt. I think even as a non-health professional, it's safe for me to say that you should lean towards whole foods, non-processed foods, which still give you salt, and you should pay attention to your salt intake. And there's a lot of other reasons why you should have a whole foods diet or why that's important. But sometimes this is really, really hard, especially when your body and millions of years of evolution kicks in, because we go back to that very important and very basic fact that your body needs salt. It's so important to us that our body has its own unique taste sense dedicated to salt, along with bitter and sweet and sour and umami. And sometimes those taste buds steer you away from things that you shouldn't be eating, which is why we have sour and bitter. And sometimes it steers you towards things that you really need, like salt. And a minimum amount of sugar, right? You don't want to have too much sugar, similar to salt. And so basically, we love salt because it is so important to us. And the problem is it's easy to have too much of a good thing. When your body needs salt, when your salt stasis becomes too low, your body then produces a salt craving. So that is a really important, essential physiological action. Hey, I need salt, go eat salt. And we've all probably felt that salt craving when you're looking for food. I mentioned that the rawest form of salt in nature is halite or rock salt. And so salt deposits have happened from ancient seabeds. You have places like the Great Salt Lakes. You have salt is very common. Sodium and chloride ions are very common. So there's a lot of places where salt is produced. And again, it's very water soluble, so it makes its way into our oceans. And Sometimes these deposits, which get buried underground, will reach the surface, and then they're available to animals as salt licks. And again, those are often the surface of these very, very large salt deposits from ancient seabeds. They can be hundreds of feet deep, cover many, many square miles, and salt has been unbelievably important to humans for pretty much ever. And so, if you are a culture that controls a salt deposit, that is probably similar to a modern day equivalent of a country controlling oil deposits. Economies and cultures were based on salt. Wars have been fought over salt. The salt trade was massively important. So even today, you still have massive salt mines. And once you get that raw halite, the raw rock salt, the mineral, up from the mines, you can use it in that pure form for some really important uses. The most important being to melt ice to make ice cream. And there are other less important uses like industrial brine and chemical production, much more boring and not ice cream. Rock salt continues to be used to melt ice on roads, even though, at least since the 80s and probably way longer than that, we've known of the devastating effects of salt on roadside vegetation and waterways, something we need to continue to put pressure on the agencies that control this. I know some communities have experimented on other things like beet juice and other less harmful forms of salt, and we should continue to put pressure on them, just not only because the devastation salt can have on land, and we've known of the devastating consequences of salt on land for way, way, way longer than the 80s. When conquering armies would leave an occupied area, there's a saying to salt the earth, and that was an activity where you would plow salt into agricultural areas, which would make that land no longer arable. It's pretty poisonous for the growth of plants, which was pretty much out of spite or to add insult to injury, just so that when the people returned to the land that they conquered, they wouldn't be able to use it. So pretty unnecessary, pretty harmful, pretty spiteful, but we were aware of what salt does to the planet. And we're still aware of that, and we're still putting it into our roads, we're still putting it into our waterways indirectly, and that has huge effects. It's a major issue, particularly in urban environments. So once you have rock salt, a common next step is to produce table salt. And that's the salt that most of us were familiar with, at least in common everyday Western cultures, at least. That very fine grained salt that is in the salt shaker that you're trying to balance in your kitchen. Table salt is often iodized because modern human diets tend to be low in iodine, which is another essential nutrient, particularly important for fetal development. So when iodine was added to salt, there was studies that showed that IQs of humans in the Western world where this was done rose because of better fetal development. So in table salt, like in table sugar, all of the impurities are removed, and you have a very predictable, very pure product. If you're baking, it's going to give you easy to measure out, predictable use of what's going to happen to your cakes and your cookies and things like that. So it's a easily manipulatable, predictable, pure product. And they declump it through chemical agents, and you remove pretty much all of the impurities. And like with table sugar, some of those impurities are really good for you. And you have almost pure sodium chloride and possibly iodine. Another common form of salt that's re becoming popular again is sea salt, which is often still harvested by hand, a little more expensive. It is not processed to the extent that table salt is, so the trace minerals that give it a different flavor, a different color hue, they're left in, and you can have intricacies. You can have individual salts giving certain qualities to food depending on the minerals. They can be pink, which sometimes comes from copper or iron or both. You can have black sea salt, which sometimes comes from lava or charcoal. Sometimes the sea salts get color from algae. So there are algae that can live in salt environments. We know that they're the extremophile algae. And so when you harvest the salt, you're harvesting the algae. And sometimes the algae will produce a pinkish pigment through the beta carotene pigment that it produces. So sometimes you are eating a little algae with your salt, and in this case, it's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. So a lot of the people really into food like to experiment with different types of salts, different types of sea salts. There's kosher salts, and kosher salts are used to make food. What's the word? It'll come to me in a second. Kosher. Yeah, make food kosher. That makes sense. And it's not the salt itself that is becoming kosher, it's the salt that is making the food kosher, which was a little new to me. And so you have all different kinds of salt, many, many different types of salt, different grains, different additives, different trace minerals that you can experiment with. Some are good for baking, some are good for cooking, some are good for finishing after the food has been cooked and you sprinkle it on top. And because there's so many different kinds to choose from, there's a lot of people that really are into salt and experimenting with salt and salt blocks and cooking and smoking. And so it's a really, from a culinary perspective, a really fun way to add flavor to your meat or vegetables or whatever you're eating and to gain that essential body function to you. So in meat, salt draws out the moisture from the cells. And it's hard to stay away from more stories of the human relationship with salt. The relationship certainly goes back to prehistoric times. The first evidence that we have dates back to 6050 BCE or 8,000 years ago. Used as a spice, probably more importantly, used as a preservative. Because if you think about, if you go back to the harmful effects of, that too much salt has on your tissues, that same process is what you want if you're going to preserve the tissues of the animals that you're eating. So when you add salt to meat, it draws out the moisture from the cells, just like it draws out the moisture from your cells, from the extracellular tissue. It draws out moisture, it draws out blood, it drains and dries out the meat and creates an environment then in that meat that is toxic to any bacteria that might make their way into it to spoil it. So if a bacteria gets there, it's toast immediately because of that high salt environment. And then the human is eating that salt again, which we need also, just not in too high of a concentration. That process of drying and drawing out moisture is called curing and has been known and important to cultures for thousands of years. Many, many more stories of how salt has impacted human history. And for today, I'll I'm kind of going away with the idea that I probably will be a little more cognizant, a little more mindful of my salt intake. And I think I'm also going to be excited. I try to think about what the food that I'm eating is doing inside my body for all of these things that we've been talking about. And with the salt, it's allowing for electricity to happen. And that's something fun to think about when you're eating salt. It's allowing me to live and move and play and learn about how important salt is for my body. And that's pretty cool. So thank you for joining me today. I love the time I spend with you. I'm honored that you're spending this time with me, and we will see you next week. And I will stop sharing my screen. So that's salt.